With the upcoming update on the 5th, we did get confirmation that CYL6 is going to be getting their refines, and whether or not they should be getting these refines so soon is up for debate, but I figured this be a good opportunity to talk about potential refines that I would like to see in all of them, because there is a good chance that if they were to get some of these effects, then they could probably end up being really good afterward. And I did this last year and the year before that, so I figured let's just keep up the tradition. Starting with the unit that I think has room for the most potential in Brave Byleth. Brave Byleth was definitely one of those units that never really took off, but I think had a lot of potential to do so, mostly because of her PRF special Divine Pulse, but that was also during the era where ranged flyers weren't exactly the best. They were getting buffs, but they didn't start getting all the skills really necessary until the following year and a half. But for what it was worth, Brave Byleth was definitely one of the better ones because she had no follow-up and all sorts of other gimmicks that could at least allow her to remain consistent, but she never really had that taking off pressure. But even so, her base weapon of no follow-up, times pulse 4, and spectrum stats with slang was not really the worst thing by any means. Divine Pulse was, I would say, doing a lot of the heavy lifting because she could at least initiate on somebody really well, and then you had unpierceable 75% on your special, which was not a common thing back then. We did start getting a lot more specials that had the integrated can't be pierced damage reduction, but this was definitely one of the first of its kind. And I would imagine the reason that she ended up just never also taking off is that by the time that she probably could have, we just ended up having a lot better units that could do so much more than she probably could have, even with the failsafe. I imagine IS had the idea of making her an enemy phase unit, given that she came with speed preempt, but she never necessarily had to commit to being an enemy phase unit, and that's why I think if they do end up refining her, I think they should give her effects that at least allow her to compete in both the player phase and enemy phase, just so you have the flexibility. And I think the biggest thing missing from her at the moment is damage output, because she could potentially eat hits really well because Divine Pulse is just an incredibly good special, but she doesn't have the damage output consistency, especially nowadays where tanks are just actually really good. So I'm thinking that if they do end up refining her, first off, they need to give her more stats, which is just par for the course on any single refine, but dumping it more into attack and speed I think would be a lot better than just doing spectrum stats, even though they could, just to make her bulk even better. And if they attempt to build the refine around her base kit, because they tend to do that on the occasion, it's not always consistent, but it's there more often than not, I think they should throw damage reduction piercing into it. Doesn't even have to necessarily be the full amount, it could just be per hit, which I still think is a really good option, but you know, they could still do on special because she is a special proccing nuke. That's her whole gimmick. I think even then you need to just have more ways of consistently getting damage out, and my personal recommendation is that they do what they did with T-Ira and made it so that she could get a double proc desperation thing going on. Whether she's initiating combat, she could get desperation, or enemy phase, and then she could get double Divine Pulse going. It will make it so that you don't get the damage reduction on the follow-up, assuming that you do end up killing, but it is still there as a failsafe against maybe hardy bearing tanks, or you just happen to miss a kill. Even though the idea is that you would have her be more consistent in killing, it's still a nice failsafe to have regardless. And assuming that it is taking the base kit into account, you definitely want to make speed checks, because even beyond the fact that she has speed preempt, just naturally not getting doubled, especially with Divine Pulse being around, is important, because the damage reduction is only going to apply once. So if you end up getting doubled anyway, then you're just effectively going to have zero bulk at the end of the day. And being a ranged flyer doesn't really help in that regard when it comes to just eating hits. Of course, we do get exceptions from time to time, like a Tuned Micaiah, but generally speaking, you just don't want her to get doubled. And I think making her speed checks consistent while also throwing on tools that allow her to get damage output consistently, I think at that point she'll just be set as a player phase nuke, and if you really wanted her to be enemy phase. I think the only different thing they could potentially do to make it really worth their while is throwing on damage reflection, which would actually make it so that she has to eat a hit with her special, which at that point I'd probably just ditch the desperation and special jumping gimmick and give her HP after combat. So that way, at least if she has to eat a hit, she also gets some sustainability out of it, and at least makes it so her damage output is still really good. I think as long as they are able to make her meet speed checks and she has good damage output, then it's not really going to be that big of a deal. And while resonance does exist, I'm kind of conflicted with the idea of reducing her HP while she's also simultaneously trying to eat hits with Divine Pulse. I feel like by that point you'd probably want to go in the opposite direction, where you're also able to restore your HP, so that way you could constantly enter combat if needed. But overall, I think it's relatively straightforward, and I think with the other ones you're probably going to find that it's also really straightforward, because most of these aren't really that old. Although unlike Byleth, Byleth, who never really took off. You have Brave Seliph, who was actually one of the strongest units on debut. He had pretty much everything you would want in a unit. He had high threat range. He had Canto too, so he could go in and go out really well. He had Miracle, so you couldn't blindly swing into him if you didn't have enough speed, or could double him. Null follow-up, so that you can get around guaranteed follow-ups that would otherwise kind of mess him up more. And a lot of true damage based on his movement. And while I wouldn't say that he ended up falling from good to really bad, he's definitely not as consistent as he once was. And barring the fact that he will also get stats on the weapon, there are definitely a lot of other effects they could throw onto him to make him a lot more consistent, both as a nuke and as a tank if you really need him to be. Tank in the sense that he could actually eat hits, and not in the sense of like you're actually enemy phasing with him in the same way that you would with like legendary Seliph, but having an extra layer of survivability to go alongside Miracle will definitely do him a lot of good. It was something that they did end up giving to Hel, where they gave her after combat healing, so that in a sense there was the potential to just Miracle loop with her. But I think instead what they do with Seliph is that they give him dual phase Surge Sparrow, so that way when a special goes off, he's able to at least keep the condition of Miracle after combat, assuming that he also, you know, doubles and does whatever, which is also why I wanted to move his lull speed defense from his B slot to the weapon. And yeah, they've done that before. You can look at Hariad guard and do whatever. And I know I made this point earlier with Byleth building around the kit, but you know what? Let's also break that rule, because IS does the same, even though it wasn't really a rule. But whatever, you get what I mean. Freeing up his B slot, putting lull in the weapon instead, but then also adding more stats and damage reduction will at least make it so he can eat a bit of hits if necessary. I don't want it to be true damage reduction, because I feel like that'd be a bit overpowered with everything else I'm throwing on there, especially null guard, so that he could consistently get specials off. I think something like this could be really, really good under the circumstance that he could also potentially maintain Miracle if entering combat. I can't imagine he'll need that much to be relatively good again, but anything that makes it so he can maintain his Miracle and meet speed checks will generally be a really good direction for him to go in. I still like the idea of giving him Surge Sparrow that works on both phases, at least so he won't be a complete sitting duck if the enemy decides to ram into him. And he already has relatively good damage output because his base weapon is already pretty good on that regard, but anything that makes it so he could reliably go in more will always just be a good thing for him, I feel. And then we have Brave Tiki, and to be quite frank, she might actually be the simplest fix of them all, mostly because we already have all the blueprints laid out for her. As it currently stands, she has a slaying dragon effectiveness weapon that gives her a guaranteed follow-up, and inflicts scout on the foe while also giving herself a special jump. It's not a bad base weapon whatsoever, but she definitely didn't have the tanking chops, especially back then, for her to be really solid. We ended up getting other dragons several months down the line that just ended up doing her job significantly better, and I think part of it was due to the fact that she was in infantry, which at the time didn't really help her case, mostly because any and all tanking also came from armors, but there were definitely exceptions to that rule. Regardless, I think one of the biggest things that was going against her is that she just wasn't exactly a good tank to begin with, and I think there's very easy ways to fix it, because we've seen it with Brave Dimitri. Rinka got an amazing refine too, because she's basically just grain Brave Dimitri with a lot of other gimmicks, and I think Brave Tiki can easily just follow in those footsteps. You could even look back at when she debuted, and it was pretty much a similar case of that of Dimitri, although Dimitri's whole thing was also kind of problematic because he didn't have the best res, which meant that even with defense-based damage reduction, it wasn't scaling all too well for him. And I think Tiki was also in a similar base. Even though she had good min-max stats, she wasn't exactly the best tank regardless, because even by that point, we just had a lot of nukes that could get around whatever gimmick she was trying to do. So when I do say make her Brave Dimitri but Dragon and Rinka but Dragon, I mean exactly just that. First off, you definitely want to give her true damage reduction. You absolutely need her to tank. If you are building her to be a tank, she needs to tank. But even then, I also think they should upgrade the base weapon so that her scowl effect also works on the foe's follow-up attack. Because even if she's going to be able to eat a hit, I'm fairly confident that the foe will still be able to get a second attack on her before she's able to do anything else, which makes me think that if they're going to make her super defensive, then it should at least apply to both attacks. And it's not something we haven't seen in the game already. We already got it with Fallen Veil, and that was her own gimmick anyway, but I think having it apply to foes both attacks at least ensures that she can eat hits significantly more on top of just having true damage reduction. You could also potentially have that in guard. I kind of put both in there, but I also think with the rise of tempo effects that we just keep seeing and seeing, that it's not really going to be the most consistent way of shutting off specials nowadays, so just having both around could still be relatively useful in its own right. I think also increasing the special jump to apply on both attacks will at least also help her with her damage output. And also, you know, if you're going to be eating hits, you definitely want to have the defensive pressure of the nuke not necessarily being able to swing onto you for free. So if she is able to get her special off, I think it should also neutralize damage reduction. You're basically kind of throwing in Lagoo's friend in their refine, which, you know, makes a lot of sense because, you know, that's how all these tanks tank. So you may as well just throw in the whole shebang in there, right? Give her some extra stats that debuff the foe instead, because that way it will make scout checks a lot easier, and then some healing per hit so that way she can at least sustain as a tank. I think there's easy enough blueprints for her to work off of, some things that should easily be upgraded and some things that probably don't need touching whatsoever, but for the most part, I think it is a very straightforward refine and it will make her good. I think this will definitely make her good, but whether IS will do all of this for her, hard to say, but I do think at the very least, true damage reduction is a guarantee. I would be very surprised if they didn't give it to somebody like her, especially since they would at least want to try and pair it with the B slot so you get percent and true DR, but percent DR is kind of finicky at the moment, so we'll have to wait and see what exactly they plan with her. But I think this would be a good idea generally for the most part. It doesn't seem so overpowered that it would be really annoying to deal with, but at the same time, I think it would at least allow her to stand out a bit more from her infantry contemporaries. And then lastly, we have the man of the hour, or I guess the CYL, because he never really fell off. I'm going to be completely frank. He has not left the meta since he got in, and I think everybody was in agreement that he was definitely going to age the best, because when we started getting more statuses, that's when he was going to snowball, and that's exactly what happened. He started out as Seliph's best friend, and Seliph was definitely the star at the time, but Chrom was still really good at what he did, but then we started getting bonus after bonus after bonus, and Emblem pushing the bonus meta back when she was relevant definitely helped him to the point where he's still incredibly good. But to be fair, a lot of the heavy lifting is coming from his PRF assist, because being able to copy any bonus is incredibly good. Reposition Gale Force is always really nice, but even from the weapon itself, it doesn't have a cap on stats whatsoever. So it's not unrealistic at times for him to get like Spectrum 20 plus with the right team. He's aged incredibly. So it makes me wonder, hey, what could they potentially do to make him really good again? And by really good again, I mean that's what I said for all the others. So what can they do to make Brave Chrom good? The answer? Absolutely nothing. They can refine his weapon and basically remove everything off the weapon. He would still be incredibly broken because that assist is crazy. Brave Chrom to me is similar to that of Gatekeeper, where it doesn't matter what they do with the weapon, they're still going to be incredibly good because their other PRF is that crazy. Chrom having reposition bonus stealer with Gale Force on top of it is an incredibly potent thing to have because it makes any dagger line go bazonkers. Obviously, they're not going to remove anything from the weapon because they've rarely done that. I think the only times they did that was with like Takumi and Leo for some reason, but generally speaking, it's not something you should really expect. But I think even if they didn't give him anything, he'd still be the strongest CYL6 unit uncontestedly. That being said, you could still improve it if you really wanted to. He does have 40% damage reduction on the first hit from his base, but it doesn't apply to Brave hit, so they could easily upgrade that to make it apply to Brave hitters. I think that's a perfectly fine upgrade to throw onto him. You could give him extra stats, even though he doesn't really need them, but you know, it doesn't hurt him at least, so why not? And every unit gets them anyway, so may as well. You could always give him a null guard effect if you want his special procs to be super consistent. He does have breath per hit, which is already a really nice effect, and at least allows his damage output to be good as is, but you can make it more consistent if you then want to run different specials, especially if you were to throw on damage reduction piercing on special procs. I think this could still be a decent enough refine. It would still buff him, and not to the extent that it would make him obscenely more broken than he already is. It's still a nice upgrade regardless, but I think until they start nerfing the self-imposed Gale Force assist stuff, I don't think he's ever really going to fall off. Even if his damage output doesn't end up being that great, he's still an active contributor to just massive threat range compositions that he may just end up remaining good for the rest of FEH. And to be fair, that could still be jumping the gun here, but he does have a core niche, and it's imperative that he's part of it, and he does it so well that he's yet to fall off. I think they really cooked with this unit because he's definitely one of those units that I could see people use even 3 years down the line if nothing directly messes with him specifically. But regardless, if they're going to give him a refine, I think null guard, extra stats, and piercing while also upgrading the damage reduction that you get from the base weapon is still a nice thing you could tack on, and it doesn't make him so much more obscenely broken than he already is. And really, I think the ones I'm definitely more excited for are Tiki and Byleth, mostly because they never really had their times to shine. I think there's definitely a lot of potential for Byleth to be really, really good, and I think Tiki already has all the blueprints laid out for her to be really good, but Seliph and Chrom, I think they're also relatively straightforward for what they can be. And even if they don't end up becoming Omega broken, or I guess Seliph in that case, because Chrom is still really good, then I don't think it's the worst thing, because they have been really good for a long period of time. But ideally, for people who are hoping that a lot of these units get buffed, they all end up being really solid in what they're trying to accomplish. So I definitely hope it works out better than CYL6, because yeah, those weren't the best. But I have high hopes that they will be good. So let me know down below whose refund you're excited for the most. It doesn't even have to be a Brave unit. It could be somebody like New York Kingdom, because he's also getting a refund. Nobody's talking about that either. Anyway, I'm out of here. Like and subscribe. See ya!